Alright, this first video is an introduction to Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 is all about the market mechanism, or demand and supply. So some of the concepts we're going to look at within Chapter 2 are what is meant by relative prices, what is meant by the market mechanism, which is also called the price mechanism. We'll look more in depth about what's meant by consumer sovereignty, and we'll also look at what are some supply and demand side factors that can shift demand, and what is meant by contraction and expansion in demand. So this chapter, the first three chapters are all related to microeconomics, so we're still looking at individual markets, individual consumers. We're looking at the prices in individual markets and the factors that will impact prices in individual markets, and how individual markets decide what, how, and for whom to produce. So, definition of a market is an organisation or institution where buyers and sellers interact and negotiate the price for particular goods or services. That is a really important definition. Okay? It's an organisation or institution has buyers and sellers where they interact or negotiate the prices of particular goods and services. And markets can either be physical, they can be tangible, or they can be intangible. And different markets we'll look at are things like the property market, the wool market, the stock market, fish market, fruit market, labour market. We don't look at any of these markets in a lot of detail, but you need to be aware of the factors that can impact prices in a lot of these markets. Alright, so purchases and consumers. When you refer to the term purchases, we may be talking about households can purchase goods and services. Businesses can purchase intermediate products or capital products to further sell to the market or to sell to households. The governments will purchase types of goods and services, and other economic groups can also act as purchasers of goods and services. Suppliers of goods and services, again, it can be businesses, it can be households, and that's really common in the labour market, so households will supply their labour to the market. Government bodies are also suppliers of different goods and services. So as you're aware, government provides certain services like Defence Force, public services, teachers, fire brigade, police. Alright, whenever we're looking at these markets in Chapter 2, we're making some assumptions of buyers and sellers. So we're assuming that we're talking about competitive markets. And in Chapter 3, we'll start to look at different other types of markets, like monopolists, oligopolies. But in this instance, we're looking at purely competitive markets. And some of the features of competitive markets is that we're assuming there are a large number of buyers and sellers in all the markets we're working at in this chapter. Each of them has little influence on price, so all sellers or suppliers are what we call price takers. They have very little say in the price that they charge, and again we will elaborate on that concept when we look in Chapter 3. There are low barriers of entry and exit to the market, so it's very easy to set up a business in that market. So a good example of a perfect market would be the fruit market. It's very easy, it has low barriers to entry, there are low setup costs to allow you to establish a foothold in that market. And lastly, resources can be easily shifted between one market to another in response to price signals. So again, looking at the market for fruit, resources like labour resources, land resources, capital resources can quickly be shifted from supplying apples to bananas to oranges in a competitive market. We're also assuming in these markets that initially that there is no government intervention, so they're purely competitive markets. Alright, so we know from Chapter 1 that both consumers and producers act in their own self-interest. So in this chapter, we assume that consumers are looking to make a consumer surplus. And when we use the term consumer surplus, it is the difference between the price that consumers are willing to pay for a product and the price that they have to pay for the product. So if I value, for example, an iPhone at a price of $500 and I have to pay $300 for that iPhone, I'm making a consumer surplus of $200. If I buy 5 iPhones, then I'm making a consumer surplus of $1,000. Okay, so it is the consumer surplus is the difference between the price the consumer is willing to pay and the market price. Sellers get a producer surplus is the difference between the highest price. So the producer surplus is the difference between what they sell the product for and the cost of production of that product. So they wish for the highest price possible to generate the biggest profit or producer surplus possible. Again, the price they receive less the economic cost of the good. The market mechanism, another really important definition. So you need to be able to define producer surplus, define consumer surplus, define some features of a perfectly competitive market, and lastly you need to be able to define what is meant by the market or price mechanism. And the market or price mechanism is how the forces of demand and supply interact to determine relative prices, and again we'll look at this topic late in this chapter, in different markets, and ultimately how our productive resources are allocated in the economy. Okay, the definition of the price mechanism is critical. It is the forces of demand and supply. That's what this whole chapter is about, and how they interact together to determine prices of different goods and services, relative prices, and that determines where resources are allocated, because businesses want to make the highest profit they possibly can. So generally, when they can get a higher relative price for a product, there will be a signal to shift resources into those industries. So changes in relative prices act as signals to producers to direct where they shift their land, labour and capital resources. Okay, so an example of relative price change in recent time would be the mining industry. There was a high demand in Australia for our minerals, for our coal, for our iron ore, and that higher relative price acted as an incentive for producers to shift resources, shift land, shift labour, shift capital into the mining industry, because the relative profits on offer in that industry were huge. And later in this chapter, we talk about relative prices, and it's a concept that students really struggle with, so we're going to go into it in a lot of detail because it is critical to understanding how resources are allocated in the economy. How does the market mechanism allocate resources in Australia? Well, we talked about this in chapter 1. It's based on consumer sovereignty. Okay, in a freely or a competitive market, then consumers will dictate where resources are allocated. Consumers will dictate what is supplied, because producers will want to produce what consumers want. Consumers are king because producers just want to make a profit, so they're not going to make things that consumers don't want.